We're very pleased and honored to have Michael Stein with us today. I think that some of you know him already. Those of you who don't, he is both the founder and director of the Project on Disabilities of the Law School. He's written extensively on issues related to disability rights and other rights, and also helped draft the Convention on the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and has been engaged in implementation issues with regard to the Convention, and has consulted or worked in or been engaged in more than 40 countries in that regard. So we're very pleased to have him here today. Before Michael gets started, I just want to give you a brief view of the lineup. We've got a number of people committed. We're trying to find out when they can come, but I think it's a pretty rich lineup for the spring. And you know, sadly, this will be over with before we know it, because it only means about 7 sessions between now and the end of the year. But William Kiernan is the Dean and Research Professor at the School of Global Inclusion and Social Development. So there's actually a school at BU devoted to this, and he's going to visit us and talk about that program. Carrie Thompson is someone who works at the Disability Rights Fund that we heard from Diana Samarsan last semester. Carrie was actually going to be here today, and for some reason her schedule got complicated. She couldn't come, but she is a program associate there, and she is both blind and deaf, and will talk to us about her work at the Disability Rights Fund. Lorraine Wolf is the Director of Disability Services at Boston University. She's also on the faculty of the medical school at Boston University, and her specialty is children and adults with developmental disorders and autism spectrum disorders. And she's going to talk to us both about her research, but also her work. It's a striking contrast to disability services offered there and offered at this university. So that's one thing we'll kind of get into there. Sarah and Ann are going to present sometime this semester on the NGOs that they created, and we may have others, because I know there's some others who work very closely with NGOs and tell us about their work with those NGOs and what they do. Brian Calley is the Lieutenant Governor of Michigan, who is a mid-career student who flies here on Monday, goes back to Michigan on Monday afternoon, comes back on Wednesday, goes back Wednesday afternoon. As father of 3 children, so he's got a pretty full family life, and he's Lieutenant Governor while he does this, so he's on a 2-year plan. But he had a remarkable story to tell about passing disability rights legislation in Michigan that was opposed by all the major unions, and he's going to talk to us about public policy and disability rights. We're in discussions with Senator Harkin's staff about a visit this spring. Senator Harkin, I happen to actually be unemployed purposely in the summer and fall of 1984, and I worked about 6 weeks on Senator Harkin's campaign, roving with a bunch of Vietnam veterans, going from Grange Hall to Grange Hall in Iowa, trying to get him elected the first time to the Senate. He is someone who's played a major role in the passage and, more importantly, the implementation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Is going to be joining us sometime this spring. Michael Posner is coming here on a Wednesday, and we're going to not hold a session that day because he's speaking about that time. Michael was the Assistant Secretary of State for Religion, Human Rights, and Democracy in the Obama administration. He's the founder of the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, and we'll have a chance to really ask someone who was in a very high-ranking policy position on human rights about disability rights as well. There are a few others that we're in discussions with, but that's kind of the people who've agreed to come so far. So I think we'll have a rich spring, and I'm certainly open to other suggestions. We sometimes have people change their plans or change their minds, and we can substitute some others. But I think it's great that Michael is leading things off, and I hope that you were able to get the article that we sent around, a chapter of a book that he's written. Michael, without further ado, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, and with me starting and with that lineup, that your disability study sessions will only improve over the course of the semester. So I'm very glad to be here. I understand you had Diana here in the fall who talked a bit about the convention, CRPD, and so I won't go over too much about it, but I'd like to perhaps try to talk a bit about what's in the treaty, what the negotiation process was like, where its prospects are. The book chapter, which has already come out, and this is the pre-edited version, a colleague and I wrote because we were trying to explain what our philosophy was about doing disability rights work. Janet is our senior research associate at the Harvard Project, and we've worked in about 40 countries or so together, and she's just absolutely marvelous, very wonderful practitioner, and also thoughtful and smart and clever academic. So we were trying to explain in a larger conference, which is called Making Rights Real, about what our perspective was about how you implement disability rights and some of the issues in implementing it, ranging from large INGOs, international NGOs, and IDPOs, disabled persons organizations, to funders, to short-range programming, and et cetera. So hopefully you had a chance to take a look at it, and hopefully it was of some interest. So
Michael, let me ask, would it be helpful before we start to have people introduce themselves and mention about their interest in disability issues?
Would love that, yes, thanks.
Right. So.
I'm Jennifer Nash. I work here at the Kennedy School, Associate Director of the Center for Business and Government, which has a nice conference room which you're all welcome to use. I am going to have to leave for an event at 5:30, so I apologize in advance, but I've really enjoyed being part of this study group. I have a son with a disability, but this group has really helped me become more of an activist and voice for the community, so thank you.
Thanks, Jen.
I'm Dave Bennett. I'm a mid-career. I'm disabled myself. Fortunately for me, I've been able to overcome a lot of them. But I run a pro bono program with the Department of Defense, where I'm a senior advocate for our seriously wounded, ill, and injured. I work on the programs that are funded, staffed, but aren't achieving their objectives. So I'm trying to get a little more insight.
I'm Sapna. I'm also one of the mid-career, and my background is I'm a lawyer, but I was also very much engaged in Nepal when the convention was ratified. I was a member of parliament. I was mobilizing whole parliament for ratification and worked very closely with the disabled organizations.
Hi, I'm Ann Marcus. I am an advanced leadership fellow. Actually, I had the pleasure of meeting you once before with a colleague of mine that I've been working on studying a not-for-profit called Exceptional Lives. He knew your partner who is on the board of Special Olympics here. So, and this group has just been fantastic.
My name is Erin Fitzgerald. I'm a second-year MPP student here. I came to the Kennedy School hoping to study disability policy and soon realized that there weren't many resources here. And through my time here, I'm also increasingly interested in mental health policy, and I'd love to chat on writing my thesis on post-9/11 veterans. It'll be interesting to chat.
I'm Daniel Whittaker. I'm from Switzerland. I'm in the Harvard Law School in Rights Program as a visiting fellow. In my normal life, I work at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and I'm also a teacher in international law in Switzerland, and I'm generally interested in human rights and how treaty works.
I'm Sarah Peck. I'm staff here at the Carr Center, and I also apologize. I'm going to have to leave eminently for class.
Hello, my name is Fatima Medikova. I am program assistant at Carr Center, and I interested in this program because I came from Kyrgyzstan, and I said last time that it's very, you can't see any disability in our country. And I said, oh, we don't have. But when I came here, I was joined, and I realized we don't have any infrastructure and facilities. And recently, maybe a few months ago, it was passed law for disability rights, but I'm pretty sure that those rights still exist just in the paper. So I would like to learn how implements disability rights of this country.
I'm Marcy Roth, and I'm here as part of the Senior Executive Fellowship Program. I'm here for a month. My day job, I'm the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency Office for Disability Integration and Coordination, and very involved in both U.S. disability rights, global disability rights. Had the great pleasure of working with Michael on all sorts of juicy stuff, and particularly interested in the implementation of Article 11, although interested in all of them, but particularly interested in making sure that the rights of people with disabilities in emergencies and disasters.
Right. Thank you. We're just going around introducing ourselves. If you
I'm Becky Curran. I'm a motivational speaker where I go out and try to change people's initial perceptions of little people and all people with physical differences. A lot of times when people meet me, they've never met a little person before, so I'm the first person who has to represent the community, because I spent a lot of time out in California working in the entertainment industry, trying to change perceptions that way with how it affects people and how they're treated in society and what they put on TV. But there's still a long way to go there and all around the world, because they just want to get what makes money. They just want to do what makes money. They don't think of how it affects us as a society. So now I've taken the spoken approach, trying that out.
Great. Glad you could be here. We're just introducing ourselves quickly.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
I'm Helen's sister. I know
You are.
Michael, and I'm Karen, and I've met some of you before, and I work at the Kennedy School at WeGo in the Housing Center.
David, you're up.
I'm David King, and I'm on the faculty, and I'm excited to hear you speak.
Thank you. And I just got to hear you speak, so this is a great pleasure. Okay, so I'll try not to, you won't have the law lecture, we'll have the real person's lecture. So this is the first human rights treaty that specifically targets and is enforceable in its rights relating to people with disabilities. And the motivation for having a disability-specific human rights treaty, after the UN was formed, we had 7 core treaties, meaning legally enforceable. There's a treaty monitoring body of experts that sits there and receives complaints and can issue recommendations. There were 7, and disability was mentioned specifically only one time in any of the 7 treaties. It's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 23. And the treaties, of course, are relating to human beings, and people with disabilities are human beings. And so the idea is the group ought to have been covered under those previous treaties, Women's Treaty, Children's Treaty, civil and political rights, economic, social rights, but we saw that really wasn't. There was a very damning, thorough, polite, lovely report written by 2 academics, Professor Gerard Quinn of Galway and Theresia Degner of Bochum in Germany, that was sponsored by Mary Robinson, who was then UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, and it went through the whole UN system and very basically laid out exactly how disability ought to be part of programming but was not part of programming, and why we had the need for a disability-specific treaty. UN politics are always involved. You know, how did this academic exercise come about? Well, because countries like Ireland, New Zealand, Israel, etc., which are basically small, everyone knows everyone else. We're at the Kennedy School, we talk about politics. And so Gerard Quinn called up Mary Robinson, who had been president of Galway. He was on the Human Rights Commission. He said, look, we have this need for this investigation. Could we do it? And she said, sure, go right ahead and do it. And then they saw what it looked like. It was 200-something pages. You can find it online. Normally in the UN, you get the UN seal on the front, and then the names of the authors are buried somewhere, around page 300-something in the footnotes with an asterisk. And in this case, the authors' names go on top, and the UN seal goes somewhere inside. So we have the academic, really intellectual exercise of it. There was the politics of having a special rapporteur, an independent expert who was appointed, named Leandro Despuey, who's from Argentina, who wrote a report earlier on looking again at the UN system and said, from the past decade, we've had a total of 17 complaints, either individual or collective, brought to the treaty monitoring bodies. 13 of them were declared inadmissible, and although that's procedural, what we see is over a 10-year period, 4 complaints that actually raise the issue of people with disabilities in one form or another at the UN system. Not very good. We had the examination of programming, so the biggest thing in the UN, the biggest thing around the world, right, the Millennium Development Goals, halve world poverty by 2015. We know that we have failed that dramatically, and now one of the exercises at the UN is post-2015, what's going to happen. And the MDGs have 8 goals, and 21 targets, and 60 indicators, and in those, collectively, the word disability appears 1 time. And it appears in the context of women who give birth in what is known as insanitary conditions, and therefore could become disabled accordingly. Important. But wait a minute. At the time that there was an argument to the General Assembly to have a disability-specific treaty, we said that there were 650 million people with disabilities around the world, and I hope you'll jump in with questions at any time, but specifically ask the question about disability demographics and statistics and how those numbers come about. 10% of the world's population, 20% of people with disabilities were living below the poverty level. So 10% prevalence, 20% of the poverty line, but yet one of the goals of the MDGs, besides this overall goal, is to reduce poverty. Disability doesn't appear. What's up with that? Another goal in the MDGs was education, and that at this time they said that of the 70 million children of primary school age who were not in school, 1/3 had some form of disability. But yet disability did not appear. So there was this political motivation as well. Since we're at the K School, we'll talk more politics. And then there was the politics. In 1985 and 1987, the governments of Italy and Sweden, I may have the years reversed, each individually moved the General Assembly, let's get a disability-specific treaty. We need to have it. And the General Assembly pushed back and said, we've got treaty fatigue, we've already, we've got the Women's Convention in our minds, we've got the Children's Convention, too many treaties, we've got these soft laws that we've passed with resolutions that talk about equality. It's not the right time. And actually, Italy came with a draft treaty when they moved the General Assembly and said, oh, by the way, we also happen to have one you might want to take under consideration. If you look at when this treaty started to be negotiated, when the General Assembly said, go forth and consider whether there ought to be a human rights treaty, which is December 2000, to the time at which it was adopted by general consensus, December 13th, 2006, you're looking at the Vicente Fox government. Now, what's going on there? Fox was running for president, and the person against whom he was competing for his party, and in this case it was the primary rules, was a person with a disability. And as part of the deal of backing out and allowing Fox to go forward with the nomination was you will go to the UN and push for a disability rights treaty. And Fox absolutely kept his word. And again, the treaty negotiations you see from the beginning of the Fox government when they moved to the General Assembly to right before Fox steps down and it's adopted by general consensus, and during the last negotiation session you have the government of Mexico running just about every informal, which means outside the halls of the UN negotiation process. We've got an article, we can't figure out what to do, let's meet at the embassy, right? Let's get a space, let's put together the power players, and let's hash out some language that we could all agree to.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Are we likely to see this piece of the history written in many places? Or is this kind of the history that will not be discussed in public, probably?
I think a lot of what I'll tell you, although we're getting the sanitized version, a lot of what I'll tell you is the stuff that is not in print, and that I thought is more useful than what you can find in print. So there was also the politics of pushing it. They moved the General Assembly. We need to have a disability rights treaty, and the General Assembly says, you know what? We're going to authorize an ad hoc committee, and that ad hoc committee is going to consider whether there ought to be a human rights treaty for people with disabilities, and if so, what kind of a treaty it will be. And so if you look at the name of the committee, it's got about 300 words in it, an ad hoc committee for the consideration of a declaration or a treaty for the promotion and protection of the rights and dignity and autonomy of people with disabilities, yada, yada, yada. And there's a reason why there's all those magic words in it, because they were unsure. Is this going to be a human rights treaty, meaning non-discrimination, and therefore negotiated and in Geneva, because it will be serviced by the UN High Commissioner's Office, and therefore will be part of that part of the landscape? negative rights, thou shalt not discriminate, prohibitions? Or is it going to be a development treaty and therefore serviced by the Secretariat of DESA, Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York City, which also covers the MDGs and other development bases? Is it going to be a vehicle for the transfer of wealth from developed northern, however you like to put it, Western countries to other developing countries? And therefore, all these magic words are in the name of the committee. Well, they also decided that they needed someone to chair the committee, and the UN rotates by regions, and so it happened to be Latin America. And so they asked the government of Ecuador, whose turn it was, to chair one of these negotiations or meetings, if they would do it. And Ecuador happens to have a fairly small diplomatic staff, because it's a fairly small country. And Luis Gallegos was their ambassador, and first he said, well, I'm on the Committee Against Torture, I've got some other obligations, this is a really good time for me, but they pressed him, and he thought, well, who doesn't like people with disabilities? Who doesn't like the disabled? This is going to be easy. As these things go, relatively easy, so he accepted. And Luis was the chair for the first 3 ad hoc sessions. The treaty, by the way, is adopted on his birthday. Not on purpose, but on his birthday in December 2006. And we go to these negotiations. So just to pause for a minute, how many people here have been to the UN? Good, okay. How many have sat in on negotiations or seen treaties? Okay. So here's some background as to what it looks like. In this treaty, we actually wound up with 8 ad hoc sessions, each of 2 weeks length. They went from 10 in the morning to 1 and from 3 to 6 in the afternoon. There's a nice 2-hour break in between, which if you're a fancy hoo-ha diplomat, you might go out for a nice lunch. But otherwise, there are side sessions, meaning that certain governments who want to share perspectives, certain NGOs that want to elicit information, certain long-winded academics who get asked to sit there and present information will do so during the interim. But it's also, remember, in New York. So the people who are going to be there negotiating and present are those who are either rather well off or who have friends who are rather well off, or, in my case, people who have friends who have nice couches and don't mind them too much. But for the NGOs and for the non-diplomatic corps, it's people who are getting funding. So it's going to be very heavily skewed towards developing countries, towards even the NGOs, right? Towards countries that are better situated to be able to have people for 2 weeks or more in hotels in New York. And we have to remember that when we look at the document and think about the tensions and some of the visions that are presented in it. Okay, so we're in New York. There are the first 2 ad hoc sessions, and basically the subject of the first 2 ad hoc sessions are to have a treaty, not to have a treaty, what kind of a treaty should there be? And in the first ad hoc session, all the representatives, so you're in this large concrete bunker underground, and you've got seats where all the states are sitting, and they've got their country nameplates, and it's not alphabetical, and it doesn't seem to follow any order that I can understand, and it moves from session to session. And I think it's one of the neater things about the UN that you see people with beautiful, with beautiful variety of different colors and languages and clothes and habits and cultures and foods. Often their governments are in conflict with each other, and they're sitting there amicably and chatting with each other. I find it very hopeful and very positive. But you're in this bunker here underground, and there's going to be negotiations. And so 192 countries, plus the Palestinian observer, plus the Vatican See, are there. And for the first time in UN history, we've got participation. For the first time in UN treaty negotiation, the targeted group, the stakeholders, people with disabilities, are present. Which isn't to say women were not present during CEDAW, they sure were, but their NGOs were not there and not allowed to speak, not allowed to negotiate. And why is that? Well, it's almost an accident. Because it was the authorization to consider whether there ought to be a treaty, Ambassador Gallegos said, well, okay, we've got this ECOSOC authorized NGO designation. How can we possibly think about whether we need a treaty unless we've got the people with disabilities here? By the way, the now just former vice president of Ecuador is a wheelchair user, always connected. Luis had that connection with other people with disabilities within the region, very savvy about human rights. The former vice president is now the special envoy for disability on behalf of the UN, but I digress. And so Gallego says, okay, let's get the disability people here so we can figure out whether we need to have a treaty or not. We can learn from them. How best can we learn unless we have the stakeholders here? And so for the first time, they're present. First time in UN treaty history. So this is a dramatic sea change. The disability rights movement itself internationally has an aphorism, nothing about us without us. The idea that please do not make decisions about me without consulting me. Do you remember when you were smaller and you would go somewhere with one of your parents and they would, and a doctor or a teacher or a bus driver or whomever would say, well, what does she want? What does he need? And you felt, ah! Well, think about that as being an adult and being a person with a disability and being fully able to form your opinions and express them and having somebody make decisions about you. That's called paternalism. And it's considered very, very obnoxious by everyone, and in particular it's one of the gripes that the disability rights community has because of the history of forced institutionalization, being put into social care homes, forced sterilization, preclusions from things like marriage or deciding who to live with or who not to live with or whether to have a family or whether even to open a bank account. And so one of the things is nothing about us without us, and this whole idea of participation was something that changed the dynamic of these negotiations, has changed the dynamic of present negotiations at the UN because the treaty that came out afterwards is a soft law. It was the indigenous treaty. It took 25 years to negotiate, and indigenous persons were pretty much not there. The one that came out afterwards, and I'm not meaning this as an ironic joke, is a core treaty, and its disappearances. Right. Core enforceable treaty body monitors it, is about forced disappearances. And of course, I don't mean this as a joke, of course the people who disappeared can't be there, but their relatives and others were able to put in advice. The one that's brewing up now has to do with elder rights, and now we've got elders and their representative bodies being there and expressing their opinions. That's slowly percolating up within the UN system. So participation became this dynamic. And during the early days, there was a pen, and don't, never underestimate the value of slogans and freebies. And the pen said on it, disability rights, yes. And Kofi Annan came to the early sessions, and he was very supportive, and he said, going through UN treaty reform, think about this as a laboratory. Come up with innovative ideas. Throw stuff out there. Don't just do the same thing as everyone else. But on the other hand, of course, don't come up with too many new rights because you won't be able to get them passed through. And if you forward ahead to the day that the treaty is adopted by consensus, and it's the second to last day at the UN for Secretary General Annan, you'll see he shows up with about half an hour left during the session. It had been the president of Bahrain who was there. And instead he's sitting there and he's twirling his pen and he's a little impatient. And if you really zoom in on the webcast, you'll see it says, disability rights, yes, right? Mm-hmm. Disability treaty, yes. So this idea of participation begins. There are 85 persons authorized to attend the first ad hoc session from the disability community. By the end of the 8th ad hoc session, 850 people. So nothing about us without us, participation as a norm. When we look at the content of the convention, I won't be too legal, we see under Article 4, governments are required to actively consult with and engage and ask the opinions of their civil society members and in particular persons with disabilities. When we look at the article on monitoring, governments are required to reach out to civil society organizations and in particular persons with disabilities and the representative organizations and engage them in the monitoring and implementation of this convention. When we look at the international cooperation article, it specifically requires that governments, when they use bilateral aid, Switzerland giving money to Botswana and Nicaragua, are actively required to engage with disabled persons organizations and think about how this programming goes forward. So this participatory dynamic is something new to disability and is carried over into other regions of UN thinking, and that's been marvelous. So the ad hoc sessions itself, the first two sessions are, should we have a treaty, should we not have a treaty? Everyone was on board, every state was on board with having a treaty during the first ad hoc session except for one country, the United States. And the express justification by the Bush administration was that disability was a matter of domestic concern. It was not a matter of international rights or human rights concerns. something that the rest of the world fortunately has not agreed with, and therefore that the U.S. would not participate, but would also not block moving forward. During the second ad hoc session, it was very clear that there would be a human rights treaty. The EU had pushed very strongly for a non-discrimination treaty. Many of the developing countries were pushing for a development treaty with the express idea of transfers of wealth and technical assistance, and it was decided that it would be a holistic treaty. It would be both, to use antiquated language, civil and political rights, and economic, social, cultural rights. To put this in a very clear perspective, not only must there be non-discrimination in employment, but there must also be special measures which can raise the group up from being below the non-disabled population up to an equal level. So, the words affirmative action appear in the treaty. The words quotas were debated but thrown out during the negotiations. They don't appear, but they're certainly allowable under the treaty. Vocational training, job set-asides, government procurement contracts, and we can go down the list. So you do both. You do both. And it's a standard human rights treaty in the sense that civil, political, immediate, first-generation rights must be implemented now. The right to be free from torture, the right to bodily integrity and non-invasion is now. But all the economic social rights are subject to progressive realization. Do what you can as soon as you can, based upon your resources. And if you'd like to ask questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it. End of the second session. It's either going to go forward. There was a working group meeting, which is a 24-hour around-the-clock, one-week meeting in January 2001, during which the treaty is basically drafted into articles, although the articles will shift over time. Some will become conflated and joined, others will be moved out, new ones will be proposed. From the third ad hoc session through the eighth, you have formal and informal negotiations. The formal negotiations are in this conference room, underground at the UN, Conference Room 4. The UN at that time is not particularly accessible to persons with disabilities. How many accessible toilets in the UN at that time? 2. Right, so 85 people at the beginning, 850. This is why we all know each other, right? Okay. Although, you find when you read the literature on gender and breaking down barriers, toilets are really important. Toilets are really important. It's where you interact informally with people and pass on messages. And when you speak to, say, some of my mentors, women who are in their late 60s, 70s, who broke the barrier for gender in law school, they will tell you about the importance of, for example, Penn Law School, and 2 of my mentors were the first 2 women there, notices for faculty posted in the men's bathroom. Important information on salaries and raises and summer bonuses posted in the men's bathroom. So restrooms actually are quite useful. Okay. The conference room itself is past the Vienna Cafe, so the UN is conducted under international law, not under U.S. law or under New York City law. So you pass through all these signs that say no smoking, but the cafe is divided between smoking and chain smoking. And there was one former judge from Denmark, lovely man with a big oxygen tank, and we were all terrified that it would explode one day as he passed through, because of all this. Inside, formal negotiations. The text of the treaty goes up on these 2 screens, and if I'm sitting in the front of the conference room facing all of you states' representatives, I've got these 2 big screens behind me. If you have a visual impairment, most people, by the way, who are blind are not actually blind, they've got low vision, but in any case, if you have some sort of visual impairment, or if you're actually over 30 or 40, and don't see that well, there is no alternate format provided. There are no large print. There is no braille. Nothing is provided. At the end of the day, there are summaries that go out. They're called dailies. If you want to find out what happened at the UN that day as far as small arms control, or as far as disability rights, or as far as environmental concerns, they're not provided in accessible formats. The NGOs did that. For 2 sessions, it was one of the ones that I represented, Rehabilitation International. For another 2 sessions, it was the World Forum for Progressive Judaism. Why? Because they happened to be there and they were willing to do it, and so they did it. The room itself, also not very accessible. Along here to my right, to your left, would be a bunch of stairs, and those who were hearing impaired and deaf would sit up there with their own interpreters, because sign language was not provided, and often they would share interpreters. Over here on the left, You had some people with mobility impairments who could come down the hill and sit in the chairs behind. And in the back of the room, which is, the coolest part ever, was the wheelchair ghetto. And that's where I sat with all my lovely elder sisters, and wonderful people. So Judy Heumann, who's now at the State Department's disability point person, Charlotte McLean and Schlappo, then representing all the national human rights institutions, now USAID's disability point person, Venus Alagan, then president of Disabled Persons International, now Secretary General of Rehabilitation International. All my lovely sisters. We sat in Rosangela Berman-Beeler, now the disability point person at UNICEF. We all sat in the back, right in that little corner. And that's where I learned, I learned from them and with them, and that was wonderful. So formal negotiations, the text goes up, you cycle through it, the states, if they want to make an intervention, raise their placard, the chair calls upon them, and it's very technical. And Article 3, which we're discussing today, second sentence, we think that that's really redundant, we would suggest striking it. Or this article has several provisions, they could be conflated into one, or maybe this one isn't necessary or is culturally inappropriate for us. Highly technical. In the formal negotiations as well, you have, beginning before the negotiations start from 8 to 10 in the morning, an International Disability Caucus, which is all the large disability groups like Rehabilitation International, Disabled Persons International, Inclusion International, lots of internationals at the end of the word, some academics, some individuals, the European Disability Forum and others, and we would meet there for 2 hours, and and sometimes some of us would moderate the discussion. And like any other intra-politics group or any other family meeting, there's hair pulling and screaming and hurt feelings and lots of interaction. But at the end of those 2 hours, there is a paper that says, here is our position on these 2 articles. And here's what we say is important. And that paper gets handed out to everyone who enters into the conference room. And at the end of every one of these sessions, right before 1 o'clock, right before 6 o'clock, someone got to speak from the disability community. Someone got to make an intervention. First time again that stakeholders speak from the floor. And it was enormously important. In some cases it was very poignant and very powerful. So when we discussed Article 12 and legal capacity and forced institutionalization and forced medical treatment in those articles, people got up and talked about what it was like to have been put into a mental hospital, what it was like to have been forced into medication, what it was like to have known people who had spent their entire lives and the inside of these institutions. Now, step back a minute and think about who are these states' representatives. They are well educated. They are usually rather wealthy, at least relatively from their countries. They are the elite. And very often they do not come in contact with people with disabilities who are shunted aside and made invisible. So enormously helpful.
Was that the first time that a personal narrative was ever part of these deliberations?
I would be speaking outside my small sphere of knowledge to say yes or no. But I can't say it's the first time that stakeholders got to speak and make formal interventions. I would be surprised if there were not women and children and others speaking in the development of other treaties, but I couldn't tell you for sure if it was inside the interventions or side sessions or elsewhere.
How are people with intellectual disabilities handled?
Well, they weren't handled. There are equals.
They're equals, but
And
how were they represented? Correctly?
Sure. Well, people with intellectual disabilities were there both as part of larger NGOs. For example, Inclusion International would do a side session and bring people from 5 different parts of the world, and they would speak on their own behalf. I helped to form a little mini caucus for ID, which spoke during the IDC, the International Disability Caucus. People with intellectual disabilities always, even within the disability rights community, are marginalized. At HPOD, actually, ID is one of our focuses, and we work with the community because we learn from them. But people with intellectual disabilities spoke from the floor as well. So I mentioned psychosocial disability, mental illness. These are all words that are used or sometimes not so much used anymore. But Robert Martin, who was from New Zealand, spoke again in one of these interventions, and he said, he was about 50 at the time, and he said, I haven't been able to open a bank account for the first 20-something years of my life, and I was forced to live in an institution that said I couldn't handle money. And he said, I don't understand. Here I am in the United States. You've got this thing called Enron down there in Texas. They've lost $3 billion. None of them have intellectual disabilities, but you've got them writing checks left, right, and center. He said, I've never written a bad check. What's up with this? So they were present as well.
Thank you.
But a good question that relates to this is there horizontal equity within the disability rights community? And the answer is absolutely not. Traditionally, for all the wrong reasons, people with intellectual disabilities and psychosocial disabilities get to be marginalized. But here in this process, for example, there was at one point a group of persons with disabilities from indigenous communities. They came from Canada. They were there for the first 3 ad hoc sessions, and then they ran out of money. So the discussion of having a separate article for indigenous groups, the way there is one for women and for children, poof, politics, power in politics, disappears. The word indigenous appears only once in the treaty. It appears in the preamble, where they mention indigenous rights as far as being vulnerable, etc. It would have been enormously helpful to have acknowledgement of indigenous culture and rights in the education article about modalities of education, right, through own languages. It would have been enormously helpful to have it in the article that refers to property and finance, because of different notions of property ownership and use of land, and that goes. So politics everywhere influence. Okay. This is the formal negotiations. The informal negotiations, just like anywhere else, are what drives treaties, corporate documents, litigation, IPOs, on the Hill. It's not what goes on here, speaking from the floor. It's grabbing someone in the back of the room and saying, I see your position on X and Y. Is there anything I could do to get you to think about this differently? Or can we bring this other state delegation who views it the way you do, and let's all sit down together, and maybe you can educate me on how you view it, and I can educate you on how I view it, and maybe we can come to some kind of a conclusion. Those discussions happen in the back of the room, in the bathrooms, in the embassies, called informals, at bars, in restaurants, etc. That's where a lot of it gets done. But during the formal negotiations, you also get what we call, within the American context, the hidden army. It's a phrase that Joe Shapiro came up with in reference to the ADA and its passage. And so at one point, I'm in the back of the room, and Gerard Quinn's in the back of the room, and a delegate from a Gulf country who I won't identify since we're being taped came over and said, I've got a relative with a disability. I rarely see her. I have no instructions from either my home government or from the United States, because the United States, much like Russia, China, and other countries, operate through others by proxy. What can I do? Because I'm going home and I'm happy to do whatever it is. And so we would write out interventions and he would read it. So you get these hidden champions. People with disabilities started to appear as part of states' delegations, but not always as disability rights experts, rather as people with disabilities who happen to represent the states. So the government of Yemen brought a blind fellow who was about as retrogressive on disability rights as you'd like to, as you like to imagine. In fact, when he talked about living in the community and when he talked about sexual and reproductive health, he got up and said, this is all averse to our cultural norms, and this is something that we don't believe in, and we have a lot of difficulty with it, and so on. And at one point, it was the third ad hoc session. It was Nigeria that moved the chair and said, could we please ask that people with disabilities remain in the back of the room and in the audience and leave the tables for the state's representatives? And Ambassador Gallego said, well, actually, those are the state's representatives. Okay. From the fourth or fifth ad hoc session onwards, Don McKay from New Zealand, the chairmanship cycles, and we get a much faster moving drafting of the convention. The U.S. eventually allows its delegation to speak. It was not allowed to speak until the seventh ad hoc session. And we want to put that on the record because the U.S. has published a lot of information about how it supported the treaty and how it was behind the treaty, and that was a bunch of nonsense. The people who were there for the U.S. delegation included a bunch of marvelous folks. John Wodich, who headed up the ADA section of our Justice Department for its first 20-something years. Wonderful person. Pat Morrissey goes all the way back to the Reagan era on rehabilitation and knows more than many, many others on various areas of law. Marvelous, helpful, terrific. But they were not allowed to speak from the floor. 7th session, the U.S. sends a head of delegation. Who would you send? You are the self-professed leader of the world's democracies. You are the self-professed leader of the world's disability rights movement. And in many ways, the U.S. deserves lots of credit as far as law writing and programming, as far as and education, etc., for leading the way on disability rights. Who do you send to head up your delegation? Anyone?
How about Bob Dole?
Bob Dole, excellent choice. Excellent choice. Person with a disability involved in the ADA, that would be a great choice. And he's even Republican. How about sending someone from the State Department who had never negotiated a treaty before, had no background in disability rights, did not himself have a disability? That's who they sent. And he happens to be a very fine person, and he was very good to work with, and very smart and very capable. But what message is to send to the international human rights community? So,
Did they give a reason why this guy was chosen? Anybody?
it's the Bush administration. They did it because it was the right thing to do.
Who was it?
Was it the right thing to do?
Who was it?
And a lovely person and very easy to work with and very fair, but also with a particular agenda from the Home Department, which is exactly right, because you're representing the Department of State and such. Okay, so things within the convention that are sort of interesting that you wouldn't know from just reading the document. Again, the preamble, which is the kitchen sink and is the only place that you see indigenous rights mentioned. There is this tension between fill in the blanks, developing, developed, north, south, etc., on the role of family. In most parts of the world, if you want to find a person with a disability in the developing world, you go out to the big street corner because that's where you'll find them begging. In most parts of the world, if you're a person with a disability in the developing world, if you are lucky, you are living with your family and they are decent people who care for you. If you are not so lucky, you're living with your family and they're not doing good by you. And I can give you lots of stories about people being hidden and sequestered and so forth. If you are less lucky, you are living out on the street, either begging or being involved in sex trade or being involved in other forms of very difficult income production. And if you are less lucky, you have been made invisible and placed into what are known euphemistically as social care homes, institutions, nursing facilities, even if you're young, orphanages. The words that are used vary. Institutions range from the quote-unquote humane, as, and I've inspected them in about 12 countries, but quote-unquote humane as in Korea, where everyone is well-dressed and clean and well-medicated and has activities, but can never leave the facility, other than maybe once a week when they go out into the community and to buy candy and newspapers and go for a walk, and they're all kept together. So it's kind of like the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. And they never have human interaction. You know, and I went with the chair of the Human Rights Commission of Korea. They just wanted to hug us. Every time we went around, you know, to inspect the various facilities, people would come up and just want to hug us, to have that human interaction. To the less humane and more difficult, to places where, if you can look it up, and I won't do this to you before dinner, you know, places where people are strapped down in their beds, left in their urine and feces, sexually violated, raped, prostituted out to various other facilities, and it gets worse and worse from there. So there was this tension between those groups, family groups like Inclusion International, Down Syndrome International, where the families work with people with disabilities, where they view themselves not as being paternalistic and deciding for, but deciding with, where people with disabilities sit on their boards and help make these decisions. And the disability rights community, largely northern, developed, etc., that believes in independent living, which not only means making all your own decisions, but in many cases, if there's the funds for it, living on your own, or living with friends on your own terms. In the preamble, you see some of the language about family. But in the rest of the treaty, the article on family was stripped out. and any sort of role of family in decision-making or supporting decision-making, as in Article 12, was stripped out. Another thing that remains in the preamble is a kind of fossil and evidence, but is not in the article, and Marcia had asked about this. Article 11, situations of risk. Again, this is UN politics. The article, if you read it, really necessary, right? Humanitarian assistance, valuing the quality of life of people with disabilities, international cooperation, all these things are bundled up into this article. It was originally put forward by Iran, Sudan, Syria, and one other state that I don't remember. Not the group that one typically thinks of as being human rights defenders. But the article on its face is rather good. It had the words areas of occupation in its original article, because that is part of representing the Palestinians. That is their thing, to get the words areas of occupation into every possible language. That language was stripped out and appears now only in the preamble. Other things about this treaty that are interesting before we stop and go back and forth. There is no technical definition of disability. There is, both in the preamble and in Article 1, the purpose and expression of disability in terms of the social model of disability. Disability is not a medical problem. It is not something that has to be fixed. It is not a failure or a defect. It is rather various forms of impairment that, in interaction with the way that we create social environments, hinders full participation. So it's not using the wheelchair that keeps you from entering the courthouse, but rather it's building a place that's supposed to issue justice to one and all on an equal basis that some people can't get into. It's not having an impairment that doesn't allow you to testify in a court situation, but rather it is not having interpretation in that situation.
Do you mind if I ask a question on that?
Ask whatever you like. It's your read.
This is so interesting. Thank you. From the legal perspective, is it a hindrance not to have a definition of disability? Because can countries get away, like have more liberty with not implementing particular?
Great question, and it also takes us on a tangent on definitions of disability.
Sure.
The short answer is yes and no. It is considered a floor, and because Article 1 has the title purpose, you are never allowed to reserve or have a declaration, I'll take everything except for that, against the purpose of a treaty. And so the reason that this social model of disability appears in Article 1 with the words purpose is that the idea is that this is the notion of disability. So on the one hand, not having a set definition under Article 2 definitions makes it fuzzier.
Right.
On the other hand, it is the purpose of the treaty to be this social model, although really it's a human rights model, of disability. In these large treaties, whether it's UN like this, whether it's EU, whether it's US federal that then gets looked at in state, whether it's Nigeria or Germany that does the same, there is either a latitude to interpret things based upon social and cultural norms. If we were in Europe, we would call it a margin of appreciation. That is sometimes used as a shield as against obeying these large laws. We say we have our own culture, we have our own identity, we're going to interpret something a particular way. It can be used that way. It can also not be used that way. With the definition of disability, the reason it's not formally defined is we would never have a treaty if it had to be formally defined. And here's the irony that the disability rights community doesn't often talk about. We talk about disability as a social construct, but if it's a social construct, doesn't that mean that different societies can construct it differently? So it's both a sword and a shield. If we look at numbers that are put out there through UNDP and otherwise, and disability statistics and self-proclaimed numbers, Kenya and Bangladesh each claim that they have less than 1% of people with disabilities, which is complete rubbish. The 10% number, by the way, is also rubbish. If you want, I can tell you how it came there. The current number through the World Bank and the World Health Organization is closer to 15%. If you were to map out countries by developing, you would see towards the end of the developed scale, US 17%, UK about 22%, New Zealand about 22%. Bangladesh, Kenya, less than 1/2 of 1% and 3/4 of 1%. Philippines, between 2 and 3%. Physiologically, even with things like genocide, etc., those numbers are undercounted. There is, we can talk statistics if you like all day. There is the Washington City group, which has 5 questions. Our own U.S. Census has the same questions we've asked since 1932, which are self-identification questions, which are subject to all kinds of difficulties. As in, they put you in a binary of, if you have a disability, you can't work. If you're working, you can't have a disability. Really? Honestly? Okay. The Washington City group has 5 questions that are now being inputted into national surveys in Bangladesh, Kenya, South Africa, Philippines, maybe Nepal, and a few other places that are going to come out with very different numbers. So yes, having this loosey-goosey definition is both helpful and hurtful, and how far they interpret it one way or another can be reined in or not reined in. The entire treaty can be reined in or not reined in, depending upon how often states are called to task for it.
Just want two clarification. One is like there is sometimes tension between the people with hearing impaired and other group with disability, especially we found it in Nepal, like with the language of inclusive education.
Mm-hmm.
Because the hearing impaired group, they don't like that language, and because of that they expressed so much resistance during the ratification process, and they were against it. So how do you see that tension? Is it also experienced in other part of the world? Secondly, you mentioned about this convention as a disability as a social construction, but many times it is also physical. I don't know, I mean, maybe it's ignorance or lack of adequate knowledge. The CEDA uses both biological as well as social construction, and therefore even in the special measure, they have one is permanent measure, one is a temporary measure. And how do you see that framework in this context? And my last question is on the reasonable accommodation. How do you especially for the implementation part, I want to learn more on the implementation as well, maybe some other time, if not today. How to strategize for implementation and reasonable accommodation, whereas it is, the state obligation is for socio-economic right is a progressive realization. Then for reasonable accommodation, we always need resources as well, financial resources.
It's actually about 6 questions, and they're rather good questions. So let me see if I've got it all right. Working from the back forward, and I'll forget your first question by the time I get there. Yes and no. The denial of a reasonable accommodation is classified, much as it is under the ADA and under the EU framework, as a form of discrimination. So the provision of a reasonable accommodation is not part of progressive implementation, it's part of immediate realization, but, if we step back for a minute, we realize that reasonable accommodation, or at least clever ways of modifying the way that policies, procedures, etc. are done, is going to be part of some measures that will be subject to progressive realization. So how do we get people into the community? Right, we have a tension between not separating people through institutions, etc. And we have an article on independent living, which PS, is it a right or is it a duty? Close PS. How do you draw the line as between? The real world answer is politics. I had this discussion with a finance minister from a particular European country that I won't mention. And he said, how do I draw the line? I said, it's as much as you feel you can get away with. But in as far as a real legal technical way, we don't know. And lots of these things, part of the answer will be, well, we can achieve this by accommodating people. And then the question is, okay, and if the denial of an accommodation is a civil political violation, as it says here, and a form of discrimination, is it subject to no cost barriers? All accommodations are necessary? So these are questions that are not answered and that have tensions. Another question was on, you had mentioned in the context of the deaf, which is right, but it's also in the context of the deaf-blind and of the blind. And as part of the negotiations at the IDC, the blind and the deaf-blind supported the psychosocial groups in coming up with a very fundamentalist version of legal capacity, which is not reflected in the ultimate text, and despite their screaming to the contrary, is not what's going on in the world. All people have full legal capacity, and there's never any substituted decision-making. Really? People in comas can be facilitated? People with 12 IQs can vote? Honestly. But in respect for that, there is a loophole in the education, and by the way, this education is not just primary school, it's lifelong learning. But there is a loophole in it which says basically blind, deafblind, and others can be, can, if they so elect, have modalities that are more intended, blah, blah, blah. What that means is, when groups like the deafblind and the blind, etc., wish to have separate schools and feel that for cultural reasons they ought to be educated separately, that they can do so, and that it's not a form of prohibition under the CRPD. But yes, there is a tension. Your sub-question on that is that a tension that's played out all over the world? Absolutely. Absolutely. One example is we're doing a project all pro bono with Bhutan. And they have all the best of intentions, and the foundation that's going to support it is all the best of intentions, and they're getting all kinds of different information. So Gallaudet went out and said, you must have separate schools for the deaf. And the Australians went out and said, no, inclusive education, not the way to go. And it's a rural country. And if you're going to have deaf children in a rural area getting education, do they have to go to residential schools, which are not inclusive, they're segregated? It's a tension that's played out over and over again. In some cases, we would say as Americans or Westerners that we made those mistakes, don't repeat them. But then we also have to consider that we cannot be culturally imperialistic, and that countries have to figure things out for themselves, even if we give them information and etc. And you had a question in between as well. That was 3 and 1. What was number 2?
Well, maybe last, the social construction and the physical or biological.
Yeah, I'll give you Disability Theory 101. Disability theory, as it is expressed by the international disability rights community, is that it is all a matter of social construction. And but for your attitudes, much like but for your attitudes on race and gender and otherwise, we would be included and we would all be equal. But if you pause for a minute, some reasonable accommodations will not reach certain people within the disability community because of their various characteristics. Universal design will not reach all members of the disability community because of their characteristics. And so actually the social construction at some point comes up to a dead end and doesn't reach as far as a human rights model of disability, which is one of the ironies because the disability rights community internationally and domestically here have been trained for so many years to express the social model as our great credo, as the one thing that we believe in almost to a religious extent, that when academics and others point out that human rights go further, it's not just formal justice, equal, but it's also all these special measures, that you run into a kind of disconnect.
Can I maybe poke at that a little bit? So, in the context of emergencies and disasters, we've had to really struggle with reasonable accommodation. And I think this is true, certainly not just in the United States, but globally, in the exigent circumstances of a disaster. All bets are off, right? Here in the United States, it's very clear you cannot waive civil rights, regardless of the circumstances. And I'm a very staunch and proud proponent that, yeah, in fact, that's entirely true. But what we've been doing is really sort of trying to take it beyond the context of disability. So we talk about people with disabilities, and then we talk about others who also have access and functional needs. So, there are those who have those legal protections that may or may not be well defined depending on where you are. Then there's a whole bunch of other people who are going to benefit from the very same stuff. And so whether it's the social construct that we are so adamantly, religiously committed to, or whether it's that physical reality when the social construct has failed or has not matured, right? There are lots of folks who benefit when equal access, universal accessibility, beyond the universal design piece, right? And like, there are those of us who can talk about this very comfortably amongst each other, but when you try and take it out of those circles and you try and take it here, we get really constrained again. So I'm just bringing all that up to sort of like, you know, kind of puke it on the table and say, you know, we know what we mean, wink, wink, nod, nod.
Right. So there's two parts of it. One is the big point, which I agree with, and if you really can't sleep at night, there's an article that Anita Silverson and I did that's coming out in Chicago about how we ought to expand the notion of accommodations, because we're missing all these people who don't technically have disabilities but have impairments, right? And especially elders and others on the life scale that it works on. So I agree with you entirely. But at some point, you know, reasonable accommodation and social model and other things, and even human rights model, because of expenditures, comes to a hand, right? In your context, there's some things that make sense and that are fairly easy. Right? Making sure that shelters understand that some people will actually turn up with dogs, right? For various reasons, not just visual impairments. Telling shelters that certain people will need access from third parties, not somewhere registered because they need their meds, and will be showing with meds. But at some point, you know, does every shelter have a deaf-blind tactile interpreter? No. Would it be nice if they had a list of languages and one of them was, you know, deaf-blind tactile? Yes. Would that be inclusive and proper? Yes. But we can continue pushing down the line. Will there be a hospital bed in every shelter? Probably not.
What isn't the issue, and couldn't you sort of, wouldn't it be true in virtually any situation that the more we invest in true nothing about us without us, that no, you may not have that tactile interpreter there, but you would have been planning along with lots of other folks for whom the possibility of providing tactile interpretation is not some new sort of like, excuse me, never heard of that before,
Yeah,
right?
and the more we move as societies towards visions of inclusion, which also include people who happen to have different sexualities and maybe transgendered and their body types are different for that reason, and so on and so forth, the easier the inclusive mandate and dialogue becomes.
And boy, don't we have a great opportunity in those exigent circumstances, right? To really, because if you can pull it off in planning for the unlikely, then you have absolutely no reason not to achieve it in the day-to-day.
And you can learn a lot positively and negatively from when the stuff hits the fan as to what the responses to are. Absolutely. So, more about what's in here that's interesting. The treaty wraps up at the last day of the last ad hoc session. There are informals going on. Messages are being brought back to the conference room. Text is being submitted. Ambassador McKay was absolutely brilliant in letting everyone think that they had a great input to things, but no one got exactly what they wanted. I've now seen some critiques of the convention as far as its language. You could do a textual analysis and find inconsistencies in the language, and that's true, and other criticisms of various parts of it, all of which are true. But it's an amalgam of, you know, with the state's representatives changing seats and identities over time, over 5 years. It's an amalgam of thousands of people contributing to a text, and it's going to be inconsistent, just like any document put together by a large number of people will be. The monitoring is a little bit more innovative than the other treaties. It has the basic vanilla stuff of the other treaties, but then has some interesting wrinkles in it. There's an article by Janet and myself about it because we actually put together the monitoring proposals at a workshop we held here before the 6th ad hoc session with the National Human Rights Institutions. So there are some interesting and cool things that the committee can do, as in receive collective complaints and look at systems and systematic discrimination instead of looking at just individual complaints and rights, which are very important nevertheless. They can reach out to UN entities and bodies and request information and assistance. They can require investigations. There are interesting things that the committee can do.
Was that a challenge getting those provisions in there? Because those are the kind of things that the U.S. would resist. And I know the U.S. wasn't kind of intending to sign this in the first place, but did other countries kind of resist some of those?
There was resistance to it, not so much from the U.S. China was very resistant to any monitoring, and eventually came around on the watered-down version of the monitoring. There was resistance to some of the more innovative policies which were drawn from weapons and environmental treaties as being too progressive. We had had the message from Kofi Annan to think outside the box, and so we tried to do. And so it's about 20% more innovative than standard treaties, but not the 40 or 50% that was pushed forward, subject to compromise. The convention was adopted by general consensus. If you look on the UN Enable site, Google UN Enable, you can see the streaming on the day and individual countries making representations of how proud they were to support it, including the man who succeeded John Bolton because he had left the day before, about how the U.S. was so involved and behind it, which is, you cannot see the people up in the inaccessible General Assembly galley
Gagging.
laughing and pointing fingers. General Assembly at that time also inaccessible, and so I'm sitting on the floor, originally next to the Austrians, but they made mean faces at me, so I sat with the Israeli delegation. If you fast forward, the UN is now being renovated, and Ban Ki-moon, in an early Disability Day, December 3rd, came and spoke and expressed shame, which is very significant for someone from the Asian context, in the lack of accessibility, and promised that the new UN would be accessible, and they are doing so. And the temporary building, which is by no means temporary because there's no way they're ever knocking down a 4-story building with elevators and bathrooms, there is access all across the board. So the UN has moved forward. The treaty opened for signatures. The U.S. did sign. President Obama promised to do so and kept his word. The U.S. has not yet ratified. It lost the first time through the Senate. They're gearing up for another go through the Senate. The committee is up and running and receiving states' reports and individual complaints and shadow reports. The UN system most dramatically is shifting towards disability inclusion. So point people like UNICEF and DESA and others, interagency task force. Slowly but surely the UN is moving in the right direction, which is great. Will it really be real as far as the UN? So far at UNICEF, our friends are doing well, but there's a problem with things like the post-2015 MDGs, because no one knows exactly what it means. The General Assembly passed resolutions for disability inclusion. Nobody knows exactly what it means. Some of us in little pieces every now and then have pointed to targets and indicators, but no one, and this includes me, has actually sat down with the economists and actually worked through what the new targets and indicators are and how the people who are on the ground and who are geeks, they've got their checklists, they're supposed to put things in. If you're not counted, you don't count. What exactly they're supposed to do? That hasn't been clear, so that's not clear. There is a inclusive development mandate for international aid. That is usually significant. Every year there's something like $125 billion either in loans or gifts put around the world as far as development. The EU is the largest development donor in the world, and the EU is both a signatory and a ratifier of this convention. They have acceded to it. And so we're seeing the development of guidelines in places like Australia, which is a good case example of leading the way. Norway, which is really a good country, but in their own self-assessment spent 1.6% on disability as part of their development aid, not acceptable, and we're working with them and others are working with them towards it. But to me, that's the big driver. You know, although there's law reform, and I've done it in lots of places, and, you know, constitution writing, and I've done that as well, and it's all important, and as a lawyer who teaches lawyers, I think it's important. It's the development that's going to make the difference. The bank, you know, the bank-driven buses, you know, that are bought, the dams that are built, the employment programs that are put in place, making those disability inclusive are really what's going to drive this, at least over the next 20 years. And that changes the attitudes. When you see people, and they're not other, and they're not silent, and they're not invisible, that changes things. So questions or thoughts?
Well, I think one of the other areas very closely aligned with that, as we're looking at the HEOGO framework and the disaster risk reduction, the post-2015 focus in disaster risk reduction, I think we've made real progress in sort of shifting from thinking about people with disabilities, older adults, as vulnerable, special, at risk, and rather talking about it from a disproportionate impact perspective. And, excuse me. So if you look at development and both disaster risk reduction and recovery as being pretty tightly aligned, I think there's a real opportunity as we're shifting what it is we mean and then shifting what it is we do.
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity. So just to put your comment in concrete terms, Haiti, everyone goes down. Everyone helps the Haitians. Great, wonderful. Wheelchairs, prosthetics, great, wonderful, necessary, right?
Yeah,
Those was, you know, those DPOs that talk about rehabilitation is a bad thing, you know, come with me to Vietnam and see people, you know, who, by the way, are suffering third generation from Agent Orange and landmines, etc., and tell me that wheelchairs and prosthetics are not important. But the question is, what happens next? Is Port-au-Prince going to be accessible? I see no plans for that. Are people with disabilities going to be thought about in terms of employment and social inclusion? I don't see any plans for it. Right? The AIDS workers go down, they do very good and necessary work. The doctors go down, they do very good and necessary work. And then they leave, and the question is, what's next? So your point is exactly right. There's this real opportunity to think about it, especially in post-natural disaster, which you mentioned, but also in terms of post-conflict areas. Places like Sierra Leone and Liberia where you've just got burnt ground. And if you're going to be rebuilding societies, there's this opportunity to do it in an inclusive manner. And disability is part of that, but other groups are part of it too.
And whether that's Sierra Leone or whether it's New York City that's getting $50 billion in post-Hurricane Sandy funds, every dollar, we need to be focusing on every dollar being invested in universal accessibility.
I agree.
I know you do.
I had a quick question. You were talking earlier about people with intellectual disabilities and psychosocial disabilities being marginalized within the overall disability community. Do you foresee any progress in that area moving forward? Do you believe these two groups have any place or will have a place in the treaty moving forward?
Well, they were quite prominent, especially the psychosocial disability, because one of the two people who pushed at the IDC, one of the two leaders, was a woman with psychosocial disability. And I happen to disagree with her and think that she's wrong on a number of legal matters. But the fact of the matter is, she had her hand up. Anytime there was something to do, sure, her hand was up. Anytime there was something that needed to be done post-treaty, her hand was up. And whether or not I, in my personal capacity, agree with all their positions, there has now been this real nice push for people with psychosocial disabilities, and they have really come out in the fore. People with intellectual disabilities, I think because of their role here and elsewhere, have also really come out in the fore and are getting more traction. And my point is that as a community, when we say nothing about us without us, I think we always need to be very introspective and self-critical about, do we really mean it? So when there was pushback on the treaty at the negotiations by certain groups, specifically the Vatican, the Arab delegation led by the Syrian representative, although not the Jordanian, who was fantastic, and the Southern Baptist National Right to Life Coalition, which was the DPO our government in the U.S. sponsored to attend, when they talked about it as a gay rights convention, which I personally would be delighted with, but there is no right to gay, lesbian, different sexual minority status under the UN system. When there was pushback against it and we said, can we form language in such a way that maybe opens a hole or something, the IDC said, oh, no, that would just, that would just kill the treaty. We can't do that. And some of us said, wait a minute, nothing about us without us? So we have to be very cognizant. The fact that there is not a separate article for indigenous persons may or may not be, may or may not be tragic, but the fact that their rights and their perspectives are not included in education and in property and in other areas, or the article on cultural participation, that hurts, and that's a failure. So I think we need to be very cognizant about being inclusive. And that includes all of us.
Are there some points you are disappointed about the convention? Are there some points which you would think it's a shame we don't have this included? Or, the indigenous peoples you mentioned, other things you found disappointing or?
In retrospect?
Yeah.
I think it would have been nice if the elder community and those representing elders were present. They were invited several times. They never showed up. Ironically, now what's percolating at the UN is an elder treaty, and they're reaching out to the disability community and saying, healthcare, gosh, that affects us too. Perceptions of asexuality, that affects us too. Legal capacity and maybe needing help, maybe not needing help, that affects us too. Physical access, boy, that affects us too. I think it would have been really helpful to have them there. The convention, is no one got everything they wanted from it. I think overall it's an incredible document, but I'm also very cynical about it. I think that if a government really, really believes in disability rights and doesn't ratify this treaty and has a constitution that says all persons are equal before the law and really, really means it, they'll be way out ahead of a government that doesn't really believe in this but ratifies it for all the wrong reasons. So I'm a bit cynical that way, but as a lawyer I still try to write the best things that you can. And if you like at some point, because you're over at HRP, come on over and we could talk about the cases we have before the European Court, including Kish, which was ours.
We have an interesting case which I prepared, not yet decided, where a person was refused in a cinema in Geneva because the cinema said for a security reason we can't let you in. If there's a fire, it's quite interesting. I will give you the reference. It's not decided yet. It's just in Switzerland. It's a Swiss case. Switzerland hasn't ratified or is in the process of ratifying this convention.
Yeah, but
we will try to find a way to to apply one of the European conventions articles, probably right to private life, for instance.
No, because Glore does.
Ah, you know Glore?
Of course I do.
So it's a nice case, huh?
Yeah, Glore makes good use by reference.
Exactly. So this I wrote this case.
Did you?
Yeah, yes. It was not easy to write this case.
Oh, you should definitely come over.
Okay. So I'm happy that these cases are known here in the States.
Well, they are to me.
Well, let me thank you, Michael, for this presentation today and for the work you do with the Human Rights Project, and thank all of you for coming. Thanks a lot, and we look forward to seeing you again.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.